it's going to be okay to be surprised by things. In my previous lives, I never ever got a chance to see my kids play sport. But now, with me being there, I can prioritise them a little bit more.
When it comes to raising young leaders of tomorrow, what philosophies do you live by?
People want the rigour of success and achievement and performance. But, we have a heightened understanding now about what does wellbeing look like.
When you take on a leadership role like this, and that means that it's not all about you. Your family is along for the ride. Welcome to the CEO Advantage podcast. Today, we have Trent Driver, who's the principal of Scotch College Adelaide, a 30-year career educator. We're really happy to have you here. And I'm really also happy to have Milly Albers with me again as our co-host. Welcome, Trent.
Oh, it's great to be here.
Welcome.
Every podcast on the CEO Advantage podcast starts with the same question, and that is, what your first job that you got paid for was?
I didn't get the first job that I actually really wanted to be paid for. I always wanted to be one of those newspaper boys who was pushing a trolley, with a whistle, calling people out the front of their house. There was always one of those floating around in the suburbs in Western Sydney when I was growing up. My first paid job was probably as a 14-year-old with a milk crate hog-tied to the front of an old BMX bike. And I'd be pushing leaflets and catalogues and all bits and pieces 2 afternoons a week into people's letterboxes outside their houses.
Excellent. I can see that we're going to collect first jobs, and leaflet dropping, I reckon, is going to be one of the top 2.
That's come up before, hasn't it?
Yeah.
Several times.
It does.
Popular first one.
So another thing that the internet has disrupted is kids getting their first job delivering leaflets in letterboxes.
Yeah.
Trent, you've got a really important job in Adelaide, and we'll get to talking about being a principal and a leader in a school community. But tell us did you always wanted to be a teacher, and tell us how you started your career?
Oh, look, I think I became a teacher by accident in lots of ways, but, probably a teacher by fate a little bit.
Yeah.
I had no intentions of going out of school and going into education. So I left school wanting to study law and wanting to study economics. They were the 2 things that were lighting fires for me.
Mm-hmm.
And then I realised pretty quickly that my understanding about what law was once you got to university was probably quite different to the sort of idealistic sort of ambitions you have as a 16 and a 17-year-old when you try and make career choices. But I was going to chase my economics down. And so I was really interested as an angry man, sometimes you are as a 22-year-old at university, to try and work out how I was going to make that change the world.
Yeah. And was that in Western Sydney? Where did you go to uni?
Yeah, so I went to Sydney University.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I grew up in Western Sydney. Come from a local high school background.
Mm-hmm.
And I was the first on either side of my family to go to university. So I didn't necessarily have a whole lot of role models in that space.
Mm-hmm.
But I had real interest in industrial relations and real interest in journalism and in that kind of space. And then as you do sometimes, as a university student, you run out of money.
Mm-hmm.
And I had a mate who I would hang out with on Tuesday nights every now and again, sometimes wearing no shoes, at debating societies at Sydney University. And he had this gig in a school, coaching debating kids and adjudicating debates in high schools in the afternoons. And he said, the cash is pretty good and it's pretty easy and good fun. Why don't you come along? And I did, and I just absolutely fell in love with it. I loved the buzz. I loved school life. I loved working with kids. Added a little bit of extra time onto a degree to do some more broad-based subjects to qualify me to do an education qualification at the end. And and then haven't looked back.
Isn't it funny? Another thing that happens a lot is people's career turns out to be the gig they had while they're at uni studying something else. Mine certainly happened that way as well, rolled out differently because of the jobs that I had while I was at uni. But also I must admit I finished my uni degree because would have broken my mum's heart if I hadn't. And I can remember the last year of it going, oh God, I don't want to do this anymore. So you've got a degree in law and economics and teaching, or what does that look like by the end of your university career?
Yeah, so I completed a bachelor's degree in economics. I didn't end up chasing the law down all of the way.
Mm-hmm.
And then I tapped onto the end of that a postgraduate diploma in education that gave me my ticket to work in schools in the days. not long after I started teaching. And I was always trying to keep options open as well. I didn't know that I was going to be a career educator or somebody who was going to spend the rest of their life in schools. I went and studied a master's degree in economics at Macquarie University, and ummed and ahed at that point in time as to whether I was going to end up on an academic pathway and working in tertiary education. And then some years later went back again and did a master's degree in educational leadership and administration through the University of Newcastle.
Mm.
You mentioned that you're an angry uni student. What were you angry about?
Oh, just angry about everything. I just really think at that point in time in your life, it's you're angry about inequity, you're angry about opportunity, you're angry about wanting things to be better.
Yeah.
And I suppose I also went through school in the late 1980s when at the drop of a hat, you'd be going and you'd be marching. So the nuclear non-proliferation agendas were very, very strong in those days.
Yeah. Peter Garrett and the Nuclear Disarmament Party and all of that was huge, wasn't it?
And activism was in your face in a range of different ways that possibly today it's not necessarily as much. It plays out in online environments rather than playing out in visceral and physical environments. So those sorts of things, were really influential for me as a young man.
Mm. And so what was your first teaching role? What did that look like?
So my first teaching role was actually in my final year of study. So I was working with the Department of School Education in New South Wales, and I was part of a team that they were called the Flying Squad. We would drop in and out to regional schools for given periods of time and do dedicated work, usually about coaching kids in communication skills and oratory and speaking and debating and working with staff. And I was doing that whilst I was still studying at that time. As I popped out, again, I had an accidental career start. I came out, at the tail end of the recession of the early 1990s, and was sending out large numbers of CVs and applications for jobs and just getting nothing back. And finally had a woman knock on my door early one morning and drag me out of bed in my pajamas, asking me whether I'd applied for a job at a local school. And I said yes, and had an interview that afternoon and was offered a job the next day. And then it turned out that my cousin, who had generously been at secretarial school at that point in time, and she'd offered to put my CV together for me, in which she did, and it looked beautiful, had transposed 2 of my phone numbers on the CV. And so it transpired later when I rang that number that there'd been people for the last 3 months that had been ringing up this lady in Pymble saying, I'm looking for Trent Driver. Do you know him? And it was somebody who came to the door because she lived in the same street as me to find out whether I was actually there that got me my first full-time teaching position. So you sort of wonder what the pathways you take are. And that first full-time teaching position was, pivotal and fundamental for me and probably shaped my worldview about education in a range of different ways. And I sort of think about those other places that I could have gone. Yeah, they wouldn't have done the same thing.
Yeah. Isn't it amazing when you said that, what was present for me at that time is that if you got your phone number wrong, pretty much you couldn't be found. Now, of course, you would Google you and LinkedIn you and there'd be a way to find you somehow. But in the late 90s, it was wrong phone number, bad luck.
Yeah, and this is pre-mobile phone days as well. It was the landline in, I was back living in mum and dad's house in northwestern Sydney.
Yeah.
It's just the way that it goes.
So was it always high school kids?
Yeah. So I graduated as a broad-based humanities teacher, as you did in the day, teaching qualified to teach things like history and geography and then my love, which is commerce, business and economics, which is where my qualifications had lie. And in your early years of teaching, I taught woodwork and I taught maths and I taught English and all those sorts of things. You just do those things that you're told, and there's no such thing as bad experience. There's only experience. But then as my career's evolved, I've been in I think a really, really pleasant and a favourable position to be able to specialise in those sort of disciplines and subjects that I've loved.
And was there a part during your teaching journey where you would look up to the principal and say, right, one day I'm going to be a principal?
There was lots of times that I looked up to principals and leaders in schools and said, there's no way I will ever do that. And I've got no aspiration to do those things. Those things, particularly as a younger teacher, were so far and away divorced, I think, from what was bringing me through the gates every morning. For me, it was the contact with kids, and for me, it was seeing impact at the start of a 40 minutes to the end of a 40-minute period and those kinds of things. And in all honesty, I never saw myself on that pathway. I tried to get out of teaching a couple of times. I didn't try to get out, it's the wrong thing to say. I was always skeptical as to whether or not I was going to be trapped in teaching. And in my first full-time engagement at a suburban school in Sydney, I saw people in their 40s and their 50s who were trapped in education. They were trapped by a mortgage, and they were trapped, I think, by the limitations of decisions that they made around their qualifications and experience early on in their career. And I watched them not have that same love for the job that I had at that point in time, and I was terrified that I would become that person in lots of ways. So I put my toe in other waters at some points in time, but could never find anywhere else that I wanted to be more so than a school.
Yeah. Imagine now being a technology teacher who's been a technology teacher for a while, where technology in the last 12 months has just accelerated so far that a lot of people are now saying if you've been off the tools for more than a year, you're out of date. But as a teacher, where you've got to be a subject matter expert, you've got to be able to contextualize, all those sort of things. What a ridiculously tough job it is to be a technology teacher now and keep up to speed. If you probably are not side hustling, you'd have to be side hustling. And how many teachers sort of do that now?
Oh, look, lots do. But it's also, I suppose it's also a perception of how we see a teacher.
Yeah,
what their sense of self is and what their role is. That traditional sage on the stage kind of metaphor as to what a teacher is that stands at the front of the room with a whiteboard marker, in that, almost like a banking model, transacts information, one way, somebody, they deposit it into themselves somehow by their experience or their qualifications or their reading or their PD or whatever it is. And then kids withdraw that in little 40-minute chunks. That's a very traditional view of what a teacher does. We also sort of look at, often talk about them as being a guide on the side. So where learning happens through experience in a range of different ways. And we can, in so many different contexts, not give kids and young people credit for the knowledge that they bring into the room and ask, how can we as teachers, build on that, shape that, focus that, and drive that. And so teachers, particularly in a technology space, who are passionate about what it is that they do, are passionate about kids and passionate about kids who take risk and passionate about extension. And so recognise that they're not always the sages, and they're not always the end point of all things knowledge in their space. Them sort of pulling it out of the kids and pushing the kids into new spaces, is really, really the challenge for them.
So you would have seen attitude, teaching change, society's sort of attitude about teachers seems to have shifted. I wouldn't say seems to, has shifted. I can't imagine my parents talking to teachers the way that contemporary parents seem to think that they can talk to teachers and or about their kids and learning. How have you seen it change from when you started being a teacher to now being a contemporary teacher? Is it the same? Is it different? Is it evolved? Is it better? Is it worse?
Oh, look, I think there's a lot of discourse about the way that teachers are treated in media and teachers are treated in popular culture and the way that teachers are treated by their broader communities. And I think, without a doubt, there's more scrutiny. There's greater discussion. And I think that the way that technology and social media have allowed us all to pass comment and all to be experts in every domain rather than our own domain, it does change. It does change the narrative and changes the dialogue a little bit. There's, for me, just an enormous respect for teachers still within community. And I think there's enormous respect for what it is that teachers do. But I suppose everybody that I work with and everybody that I engage with, is very much an expert in my space. I've cooked a few steaks on barbies over the years, but I wouldn't deign to run into the kitchen of a hatted restaurant and tell a chef what to do. But, everybody has had an experience in a school. Like, everyone has sat in a classroom. Everyone has had, really pivotal moments for them that have given them an understanding about what schooling looks like. And they all bring those things to the conversation. Schooling is changing. The structure of schooling, the expectation of schooling, the role of schooling in society is changing. And also from a research end, the information that's driving what does best practice and next practice look like in schools, is evolving really quickly for those of us who work in that space. But people still have strong emotional attachments to experiences that they've had for many years. And that can very much influence their sense about what's good and bad, what's right or wrong, what's effective and ineffective. That's just the way things are.
Yeah, it's one of the things that you and I have in common is running organisations that serve young people and employ subject matter experts in teaching, developing, supporting young people. And one of the things that as soon as you said it, reminded me, it's like, because everyone's been a young person, they think that they're an expert in being a young person, even though they haven't been one for a long time. And they do seem to be inexpert at realising that young people was a very diverse group of young people and experiences. They all just see through their lens. And I suspect that the older we get, the more we sort of go, when I was young, and sort of like you hear yourself doing it. But everyone's an expert in being a young person because they were once, right?
Yeah, and look, that's one of the there's lots of tensions in schools. Where you look at binaries, and you know that you have to in some ways play either end, but you know that Mulder and Scully style, the truth's out there in the middle somewhere. Yeah. Everybody who ever walks their child through a door of a school wants the best for their kid, and they want their kids to have an experience that they didn't get, and they want that school at that point in time to be forward thinking and to be asking, what's the future going to look like for my child? And I want you to do the best by them. But they also want that school to provide the best of what their experiences was like when they were at school. And those touch points and those reference points are really important for them. And that creates a not unhealthy tension, I think, in a school. Because, we have all come from somewhere, and schools bring, enormous tradition. And there's an enormous social contract that we enter into, when we talk to families and we accept their trust to educate their children. But then how we balance that, as professionals and as people that are considering what the world's going to be like for the children that we push into the world, in 30 years' time. That's a fun place to work.
Yeah.
I want to push now into leadership and out of school. Do you want to ask about school things before we move away from that, Milly?
Yeah. Just have with regards to, the parents, we're all, I think Scotch College especially is all about raising authentic individuals. When it comes to raising young leaders of tomorrow, what philosophies do you live by to really instill that into your students, and what you think maybe parents need to be instilling to their children?
Yeah, I think there's enormous discourse in this space at the minute, and there's, again, you talk about tensions. People want the rigour of success and achievement and performance, but we have a heightened understanding now about what does wellbeing look like, and what does sustainable welfare of young people look like. How do we manage mental health concerns? How do we manage the increasing proportions of our school populations and populations of young people that are facing mental health challenges, sometimes silently, but more often, with our help to try and resolve. And getting that balance right in a school environment's really important. School and people's experience of school is often built around, subjects and disciplines and compartmentalised things that you can sometimes put fences around. Sometimes they might happen for 40 minutes in a period on a timetable, and you can say, well, English just happened, or woodwork just happened, or sports now happening. But for us, what's the red thread that joins all of those things? So what are those core themes about character that impact upon the way that we talk about a student about an assessment, the way that we help them resolve a conflict in a playground, the way that we help them deal with failure if they don't get picked in the first 18 for this Saturday's game? How do we have an authenticity to that conversation? For us, showing young people, that challenge exists in lots of domains, and it doesn't necessarily matter whether you're on a sporting field, or whether you're in a rehearsal, or whether you're in the bush on a camp, or whether you're learning calculus for the first time, that the skills that we bring to those things as people are really important, and having a common language and a common sense about what's aspirational in that space is important for us to have good conversations with families about what does leadership and growth for young people look like.
Mm-hmm. And authenticity seems to be, it's a word that I see jump up quite a lot in Scotch College. So what do you believe what an authentic leader or authentic young leader looks like?
I think authenticity in schools plays in a range of ways. There is a genuine moral purpose to what it is that we do that not only infuses our rhetoric but has to infuse traction on a day-to-day basis. You do see, for-profit organisations who will promise the world about how they're going to leave it a better place. But at the end of the day, they are still going to be beholden to, arbitrary metrics at an annual general meeting, whereas we are really, really closely beholden to the quality of outcomes for our kids. And so for me as an educator, it's always been about walking the walk and talking the talk. Given the background of some of the schools that I've been in, the role of role modelling and the role of almost servant leadership within a school that puts our position as leaders within a context, but also role models that for kids in terms of how do they generate positive change for others and how do they generate positive change for themselves by the work they do with and for others is really important. And that's always been not only at Scotch, but in every school environment that I've been in, a really important tenet of any conversation around student leadership and leadership for young people. And it's a very, very strong ethic, I think, that all schools are really keen to leave their kids with.
Beautiful.
You've got a staff of how many?
Okay. So an average week has us paying around 600 people on the payroll.
Wow.
But that includes a sports coach who'll top up for 4 hours and coach a D's level crochet team or something like that. We have a teaching staff across from ELC all the way through to Year 12 at Scotch of around 160, and then a professional services staff probably of another 100 or so. So we would look at somewhere around 250 full-time staff.
Mm. And then volunteers on top of that?
And parent volunteers and people who are really interested in supporting the programs that we're running. And then staff, given the diversity of our programs, that are tangentially associated with us. They might be helping out in the boarding house, providing tutoring support in the afternoons. They might be assistant coaching a netball team. They might be helping out with a debating team or providing dedicated learning support as an ESO. So there's lots of those tangential things around the sides for us.
I think lots of people listening to this would be surprised when they think of a school principal and the school principal says 600 people, just like that. You go, I would not have expected you to say 600 people, but it's not just 600 people that you directly manage and have on the payroll. It is that wider community. We were talking about how everybody's been a young person, so they're experts on being young people. But you've got a stakeholder community where everybody's been to school as an expert on how schools should run, whether or not they've ever run one. And you've put your head in the lion's mouth and said, well, I'll be the principal of that, the target of all of that. Tell me though, you talked about when you were teaching and you watched principals and there were patches in your career where you're like, well, that's definitely not what I want to do. Often as we develop in our careers, we learn a lot from leaders where you do go through this patch of going, I'm never going to do that. You're the worst leader I've ever seen, or that's the worst idea, or you don't speak properly. We're experts on the leaders that have led us, usually badly. Can you, don't name names, you can, but it's just disclaimer, it's he said it. But tell us about what you've learned from some of the worst leadership traits along the journey.
Yeah, I think one of my key leadership jumps that I made and key decision that I made at that point in time in my career to put myself forward and actively chase something, was a realization that somebody I was working with at that time or working for at that time, let me put it that way, I thought that if they can do it, probably I could do it as well because they put themselves first. They saw themselves, I suppose, in a figurehead role and that was their reason for doing it. There was a gap between status and impact for me. And I suppose, you asked about authenticity before. I questioned the authenticity of leadership in that space, and then asked, who were we actually leading for? And that was my first, the first time that I genuinely thought about it seriously. I'd been tapped on the shoulder a couple of times and given project-based pieces or, programs to lead and be part of. But the first time that I really threw myself into the mix and said, hey, if I chase this actually might go somewhere, was very much on the back of somebody that I looked at and asked, are they the right person to be leading big groups of other people?
You're in leadership positions longer and you get exposed to leaders in different environments. Have you marveled at how on earth some people got to that position, let alone held it?
Oh, not really. I think, yeah, look, sometimes you do. But one thing I've also learned, and sitting on both sides of tables over the years, you never know what organisations need at certain points in time.
Mm.
And so organisations, I don't necessarily believe that there is one cookie cutter approach to leadership. And I don't necessarily think that one ethic or one approach to leadership in a place consistently is healthy.
Mm.
And I've seen people escalated into leadership roles where I've scratched a head for a minute, but then, with a little bit of wisdom and a little bit of time, and you can step back from things, you can understand why they were filling a need or they were filling a hole or they were providing some yin to other yang in that organisation, and they needed some of that at that point in time. And also in my space as well, leadership is something that a lot of people are not highly ambitious for and aspirational for. People don't go into education to write an amazing email or craft an extraordinary spreadsheet where the macros all line up or have those conversations that leaders often need to have. They go in because they're motivated by that strong moral purpose about working with young people. And so for lots of people, breaking that nexus between why they arrived in schools and the work they do on a day-to-day basis can be hard. And so I'm also really conscious that within schools, leadership is an evolving space, and it's not necessarily the pathway for all.
Mm. We've had people on the show who would describe themselves as almost accidental CEOs or accidental leaders. It kind of found them. And equally, we've had people who've like, no, I was going to be the leader from day one. I just didn't have the job yet. How would you describe your pathway to leadership? Did it happen organically and you've accidentally found, or did you spot that target at some point and go, yep, no, I'm doing that?
Oh, look, I would love to tell you an alpha story about how I had a clear vision for where my career was going to go, and I took those steps together to get there. But that's just not the case at all. I've been two things. I've been highly opportunistic in my career, and I've had people behind me with 32-volt cattle prods that have put them into me at certain points in time that made me uncomfortable and that pushed me along. When I think about this, so I've been tremendously fortunate. So when I think about the key pivotal leadership roles that I've had in schools along my journey, each time I've dropped into those roles, I've thought I will never, ever do anything else for the rest of my days because I'm where I'm meant to be and I'm doing something that I really love. And I've been really lucky in that sense, in so many ways. And as a deputy head in a big Sydney school, I worked with a long-serving school principal who is probably one of the legends in our sector in many ways. And there is a figurehead piece of professional learning around the country for aspiring principals, the flagship program. It's run out of a leadership institute in New South Wales. And he'd been pushing me towards it for a few years. Significant investment for us as a school and significant investment for me at that point in time professionally. And I'd just been pushing back on it. I don't want to do those things, don't want to do those things. And he eventually said, look, I'm taking the choice and the decision out of your hands. You're going to involve yourself in this program and you're going to do it. And so I did it because I was told, and I was a good little loyal soldier, and he told me that it was the right thing to do. And the experience that I had as part of that professional learning experience flicked on switches and opened doors and shone lights on things that I didn't think that it would. So there's been those kinds of moments where people around me have said, you really need look through that door and see what you see on the other side. And then there've been other points in time where I've just got a bit titchy and a bit restless.
Mm-hmm.
And I've opportunistically dropped into things that have kept a fire lit under me for a long time.
In my 25 years as a CEO, one of the hardest things to find was a consulting and advisory firm where they'd actually been CEOs. I created CEO Advantage to be the advisory firm I was looking for. Go to ceoadvantage.com.au and find out how we can help you and your team be the best in the business. There were two things, Milly, that Trent just said then that we've heard before. Two L words. One was lucky and the other was loyal.
Yeah.
To what extent do you think, Lee Trevino famously said, the harder I work, the luckier I get. Do you have to work hard to be lucky?
Yeah, look, I would argue in my sector that you do in some ways. The stakes are really high in school communities for leadership. Leadership is not swapped out simply, easily, transactionally because of the way that you are. School leaders have a particularly referent and figurehead space within a school community that's quite different to other styles of organisations. And so there's enormous deliberation and concern that goes on into the placement of leadership in schools at, I would argue at all levels. So you need to work hard to put yourself in a position to be considered to be lucky, and to be considered that your name might pop up around options for different institutions.
Mm. Yeah. And do you think the concept of loyalty has changed or evolved in our society from when you started your career to now, or is it still the same?
No, I don't think it's changed at all. Because I think of, as a younger man and as somebody who followed a leadership pathway, on one level it's loyalty, and that can often seem to be like a slavish relationship between people within an organisation. But I think it's real commitment to outcome. And I think it's an authenticity of relationship between people who work at different levels in an organisation. I don't think that's changed.
What advice would you have? I'm just thinking of some of my friends who are teachers, and they're currently in a bit of a rut at the moment. That so deeply passionate about young people and educating them, which is why obviously why they're teachers. But at the same time, they're also thinking, actually, do you know what? I can earn more money doing my own business or doing my own thing. So much so that I think there's even little book club equivalents of teachers getting together, sharing their ideas on what type of businesses they should set up. So, which is a real shame because, these are probably some of the most amazing teachers. We need amazing teachers. Teachers are essentially could be, the ultimate leaders in society because that's where it all starts when we're at school. So what advice would you share to any of the teachers who could be listening, who are stuck in that rut, who are amazing teachers and just stay there?
Yeah, I think sometimes we can think about our impact in terms of the things that we do and what it is that we do rather than the outcomes from it. Those people, who are excellent at what it is that they do, have a clear sense about what their impact looks like. But sometimes you've got to get out of the weeds as an educator and be able to step back from that and say, you know what, I can actually do two things. That kind of impact, can be realised in a range of different ways. And we can think as to, let's be honest, the model of schools is pretty conservative. You get a kid and you chuck a whole lot together and you call that a class, and then you get an adult, you call that a teacher. You put them in a square box, you call that a classroom. And then you take a week and you divide it up into little slots. You call that a timetable and you say, here's 45 minutes. Teachers are used to working in boxes, like figuratively and literally every day. And so one of the hardest things in education is to get us to think outside of boxes, to think about how can impact play out in different ways. And so advice that I would give to people who are passionate about education, but just sort of say, where is my next step for me, is to stop thinking about education in a linear sense. Think about education in an impact sense. There are all sorts of flexibilities that are starting to be driven through our sector. And even if I go back 20 years, I think about good quality people that I've worked with, and I think about, in some ways, the own pathway that I've taken. where I've not asked what's next, I've asked what else. And that therefore has opened more doors and opened more interesting impacts for me than necessarily thinking about schooling and progress as a ladder.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
How important in your career, you spent quite a bit of time working for, as you say, a legend in the field, and that is lucky. Perhaps it's more fortunate than lucky that you had that experience. What are some of the key things you watched that person do as a leader that really shaped your leadership style?
I suppose I saw them have a clear sense about where they knew they could have impact in a place, that they couldn't change everything on any given day. And they didn't hold all of the tools and all of the levers or all of the things in an organisation at one point in time. I saw the absolute trust that they placed in the people that they put around them. And I saw them give, in an old school sense, those people enormous amounts of rope, and trust their capacity and trust their commitment and trust their loyalty, using your language, to them and to the organisation to be able to deliver. And I also saw them put the way that they structured roles and people within a school as the primacy of their leadership was getting the right people who could do the things that they couldn't do well, and getting them around them.
Mm. So working closely with an experienced and accomplished leader can sometimes lead younger executives, deputy principals or deputy CEs and all of that, those roles, to go, well, how hard could it be to take the number one spot? Like I've watched them, doesn't look that hard compared to what I'm doing. I'm doing the real work anyway, so I'm close to it. Did you find it an easy transition from number two to number one, or were there some surprise discoveries along the way that you didn't know until you got there?
Oh no, look, I was probably the other end of that spectrum. I was probably somebody who looked at the work of, highly experienced, highly skilled, highly nuanced figurehead leaders in schools and said, there is no way that I can be that person. There's no way that all of those balls that they have in the air at any point in time I can maintain, and I don't think that I can have that impact. And so I probably came from it from a different end, and then their investment in me over time that broadened my experience, that broadened my skill set and broadened my capacities. I think brought me closer to asking that question. And I also, like schooling, professional and leadership progress through schooling is an incredibly fracturing experience in a range of ways. And so for me then to walk into a leadership role where I have leadership of a highly complex organisation with lots of moving parts, I spent a lot of time in the car park at Bunnings buying additional pieces to bang onto my extension ladder to climb my learning curve. And I knew it was always going to be like that. And I've enjoyed that as well. So I've had no sense whatsoever on the way through that it was ever going to be an easy or a smooth transition for me whatsoever. Schools have this enormously wonderful capacity to be able to promote and elevate people away from their levels of competency. So at some point in time, someone put their hand on my shoulder and said, you know what? We reckon you're an awesome teacher and we reckon you do really cool things with those 15-year-olds once that door shuts behind you in a classroom. So what we're going to do is we're going to take you away from that and we're going to give you a team of 15 adults to manage and a whole lot of high-stakes curriculum and outcomes. And we now want you to deliver that on that vision for us because you've shown that you handle kids on a windy Thursday afternoon really well. And that is in many ways the stories of school leadership and the progression that people make, that they get moved away and they get promoted out of or escalated out of their level of competency without the skill building and the training and the visibility, I suppose, of what leadership looks like in different ways until they get given that desk and that they're given that email account. which is very much about the nature of schools. Like they're highly privatised experiences. You know, you work behind doors quite often with students, and so that visibility is often quite hard. And I was very lucky that once I got to a given point in my career, I worked with two senior leaders who lifted the curtains up for me well before I was due to see what was behind them, and then gave me that experience, so that eased my transition into the most senior levels of school leadership, in a way that's, from conversations that I have with my peers, uncommon in the sector.
One of the areas that I see very senior people struggle with between being a senior leader and a senior manager to an executive role, whether that's a principal or a CEO or a C-suite person, is the transition from doing stuff to making stuff happen without touching it. And that sounds really easy as a concept to say, but I've watched people really struggle with but they don't do it the way I do it. They don't understand it the way I did understand it. They keep touching stuff. And I often, in the role that I now play with often people, it's like, stop touching stuff. But it's really hard if you're passionate about it and you're really good at it. It's hard to touch stuff, isn't it? You've been a really good teacher for a really long time. How hard is it for you to not want to touch stuff?
That's a conundrum that I face every day. There are aspects of school life that just motivate me beyond compare. And getting myself out of those spaces is really hard because those things are my happy place. But delivering those things and to have that experience and that impact on the ground is now the work of others. It is, and to use the metaphor often given to me by an old mentor, I'm now the ringmaster of the circus, and I feel that really carefully. And I'm surrounded by acrobats with long, skinny poles, with plates spinning around them. And I spin a plate beautifully, but my job is now just to keep an eye on all of the plates and see the ones that are starting to slow and to talk to them about how to speed that up and to make sure that if there's no plates over on the left-hand side of the ring in front of the A-grade seats, that I can manage to get somebody around there. Like I recognise that. But there is an in-your-faceness to being at a school, to go and grab a coffee from the canteen and to be surrounded by kids. When I have a bad day and I walk through our junior school campus, I'm like a rock star and I'm like the Pied Piper of Hamelin. The kids just want to come up and talk to you. It's very, very hard to separate yourself out from those very, very tangible impact points to be able to step back and say, my job is now the strategic impact points. My job are now the organisational impact points. I now need to walk away from those things that I suppose I've made my name in over the years.
Yeah. So for someone who hasn't spent a lot of time thinking about the role of school principal, try and describe what the job entails beyond. I think lots of people think, the school principal manages the school and the teachers and makes sure the curriculum, but it's so much more. And I've regularly gagged to you that you're not so much the boss of Scotch, but the mayor of Scotchtown. It's not just a school, there's a whole community. And because you've landed in Adelaide at an elite private school in Adelaide, of course, there's a whole expectation of you're visible to the state, and people who not even part of your community have an opinion on how you run your community. But for people who haven't spent a lot of time thinking about how far and wide your job is, can you describe some of the things that you feel responsible for and have to deal with in a week?
Yeah, sure. Like it's that tension, I suppose, in terms of what does it mean for me to be a CEO? Am I a chief exec officer or am I the chief education officer? And that's a very, very strong tension. So organisationally, I'm responsible for a very large organisation that would be in the top probably 5 or 6% of organisations in terms of their size nationally, and that presents quite sophisticated and nuanced human resources and people management responsibilities. all the way through to the financial responsibilities and then the long-term infrastructure and CapEx planning and facility management issues that those things all play out. I work in a very highly regulated compliance environment in schools. And so working very, very closely with both external organisations and also internal standards that we need to be able to maintain at various points in time. And then I have this strong moral purpose that really underpins it. And that strong moral purpose is today. So ensuring that what we do when a kid walks through the gate at 8:10 in the morning with their bag over their shoulder, that the experience that they're going to have is going to add impact to them and add value to them in a way that we can put our hand on our heart and say that we're doing the best thing for them. So what is the cultural management? What is the expectation management? What are the systems and processes that are going to allow that? I really need to be able to manage that culture for yesterday because I'm in an institution that has a very long and storied history, and that long and storied history lives large in the minds of our community. And I have a responsibility to see that social contract extend through. And then with that moral responsibility for the kids, I really need to go and stand on a hill and try and look over the horizon a little bit to try and work out what are the forces, internal and external, that are impacting on kids today. How can I be making change today that's not going to be realised for years to come, so that I can ensure that as they go through school, they've got that sense. Within that, there is also, for a school leader, important figurehead role. I can't be a desk-bound leader. I can't be somebody who's a bureaucrat or a manager. There is a significant moral place for me within a community, and that's not only walking around a ground on a day-to-day, it's not only in my interactions with staff, but it's, my Saturday mornings walking around fields on drizzly footy days, chatting to parents and chatting in that space. It's very much, my representation of school and educational thinking and best practice, at community events. And coming into this role, one of the things that I've been surprised by has been my inability, to buy pasta at a supermarket or get a Friday night pizza at a local licensed establishment without a conversation with a family on the table next door. I was in Port Lincoln last week to attend the Cleve Field Days. We have a large boarding community that comes from that part of the world. And I'd just flown halfway across the state and walked in and sat down in the restaurant at the hotel to get a quick schnitty before I went to bed. And on the table behind me was a Scotch parent who I had sat behind the previous night at the school musical in the Adelaide CBD. And those sorts of things are no longer strange to me. And so that figurehead role, that figurehead responsibility, does live large in your life as a leader.
Bit of a celebrity, aren't you?
Yeah. I don't know. I wouldn't use the word celebrity. I'd say recognised.
Recognised.
Yeah. I don't know that people spend a lot of time thinking about just the hours. A bit like politicians, often they think, but politicians work massive hours because of that recognition and because the responsibility isn't compartmentalised in a way where, I show up, do my thing, go home, have a weekend. Your hours are massive, aren't they? Can you give our audience an idea? This might not encourage people to want to become a principal, this part, but tell us about a week. When does the week start and end for you, or does it?
Yeah, look,
and a day. When does a day start and end for you?
Yeah, and look, I think school leadership is different in different contexts and different school communities. There are lots of school communities who have a very clear, not limited view, but they have a very clear view about what are the sorts of things that are involved in schools. And I work within a school community. One of the reasons I want to work at a place like Scotch and the schools that I've been at in the past is that they see education as a holistic piece and they see the school as being the hub point of a broader community. And so I love all of those things that go with that. And those things therefore do breed. They make me relatively time poor. But you go into that leadership role knowing those things. A business day will start around 7-ish in the morning. There might be an early training session that you might pop in and see some kids, or If there's a particular sporting team that's working up towards something, you might drop in earlier and go to their trainings. Across the course of that day, you'll be engaging with kids and staff and families on a range of different pieces. I would probably, as part of my role, have something on a weekly basis on 4 nights a week. And that would be everything from my governance responsibilities and working with people at that level through to student nights and parent engagement events and public events and those kinds of things.
How long do they go for? We're talking nights. We're talking finishing at 7 or we're talking 9:30?
Yeah, so 9ish is a reasonable benchmark for me to end up back at home. And one of the things,
that's a 14.5-hour day.
Yeah, that's
4 days a week
massive.
at least.
Yeah, and look, one of the great areas of school life is the co-curricular life. Like we think about school going on in a classroom, but it's kids at performances. And so tonight I'll be at a local Adelaide school till late, seeing our debating teams in their finals and such. And then tomorrow night is girls' football night. And so I'll be out supporting our teams and going around the grounds. Saturdays are a big day in independent schools because of sport. And it's often a way that community comes together. I often joked that, I've been a volleyball coach over my years in schools. It's a game that I've loved. But parents have seen me at more volleyball games and more volleyball training sessions than they've ever seen me in a classroom. But I've made my name as a teacher. And so sometimes those things that we see as on the shoulder of an educational experience are important for our leadership because they are the things for our community that are very upfront and very in their face. And so Saturdays are usually a big day in an independent school because they are a community day that brings everybody together. And Sundays, it would be, I would probably do, 2 Sundays a month that would involve community events. They would involve reunions. They would involve other sorts of important things that the school's cutting across. And that would be a typical school term. For me, because there is a convention that we try and cram the business of a school into these short, sharp periods, a lot of my deep work happens when kids aren't there during the school holiday periods. So there is a bit of a sprint drift a little bit in the way of the life of leadership.
So it's not necessarily true, those wowzers who say you guys just work, you get all these holidays and all those sorts of things.
Yeah, no. You wish that it was.
Yeah.
When do you have time for your own well-being?
Yeah, look, that is always a challenge. And I think, I have made a decision that particularly in these early formative years of my work at the school and stepping up to this role only 18 months ago, that I need to work out a way to find my own equilibrium rather than, I think, impose a predetermined view about what those sort of things look like. I try and snatch bits and pieces of time in afternoons or evenings or particularly on the weekend. The things that I like to do to try and clear my head are often usually best done in the early morning or the late afternoon anyway. And so I can usually hog tie some time around those kinds of things. But look, it is a challenge. It makes it a little bit easier for me in this current role. So I've got teenage children and they're both at Scotch with me and we're at the same school together. And in my previous lives, I never ever got a chance to see my kids play sport or blow in their trombones or those sorts of things because my work life took me in a different direction. But now, with me being there, I can prioritise them a little bit more. I can look at a Saturday roster and say, I'm going to go and watch the seconds boys soccer this week because it'll give me a chance to watch my son run around. Whereas I've lost a lot of those interactions in previous years, in previous lives. So there's a bit of give and take.
That's a nice crossover into the question I was going to ask about the hours. I know throughout my career, it's time consuming. So then that means that it's not all about you. Your family is along for the ride. And sometimes your family is along for the ride whether they want to be on that ride or not. Sometimes they really enjoy it and sometimes they don't like it as much, but you've taken them on it. But it is really a family experience when you take on a leadership role like this, isn't it? How do you engage with and how does your family engage with you in such an important and visible role?
Yeah, and that's, and I feel a level of guilt around that. You referred to me before as the mayor of Scotchtown. And it is a little bit like that. Like I live in a house on site. You know, there are kids playing footy on the oval, and on the other side of the little white picket fence is where I live. And so we have 120 next door neighbours in our boarding house. And so we are there and present, you know, in a physical sense as well as in every way. And I have been fortunate, you know, my wife and I met when we were doing our dip ed year at Sydney University in the early 90s. And we've both been worked our way through schools together. And so coming into this kind of role, you know, we knew what we were getting ourselves in for. Kerry knew exactly what we were getting ourselves in for. And there is very much a place for us as a family within a community, and that is common amongst schools. But it is one of the things that I factor in my job. It's not just a job. It is in many ways a lifestyle. And it's not just a lifestyle for me, but a lifestyle for my family, my children as well.
Mm. You're at the beginning of your, like, it's almost like one part of your career's finished and a new part of your career started, and you're in the rookie period again where you've gone from real long-term expertise into, as you described, you know, you're good at working with 15 kids, now work with 15 adults. It's like, yeah, my passion is the kids, maybe not the adults. You're 18 months into this big job now. What are some of the things in the 18 months that you've really learned quickly?
I've learned interpersonal executive dynamics really quickly.
Can you explain what that means?
I had walked into that space, you know, with probably a level of, I don't know, inappropriate confidence, if I can put it in that sense. You know, I'd been around executive teams for a long time. I'd worked in some really high-functioning executive teams, and so that was part of the role that I was really looking forward to getting my hands into. And then as you walk into a principal come CEO role, you realise that you're no longer part of that team in the way that you had been previously, and then that dynamic shifts and is different. So that was the first piece. I really struggled. There is a cultural and a ritual role that a principal or a school leader has. And an enormous learning curve for me was the level of deference that people would sometimes show to me, and the way that they would show deference to my opinion in a way that I didn't necessarily think was valid. You know, I had worked for a very long time, very keen to fly kites, very keen to put stupid ideas on the table, very keen to push discussion and challenge people around. And then when I was throwing these balls against walls in my early days as a principal, but the balls weren't bouncing back at me, I found that very confronting and difficult to deal with, because I didn't want everything that came out of my mouth to be seen by people who are still learning me and learning who I was and what I was about, seeing those things as either policy or preferred practice or the gospel according to Trent.
Yeah, it's not an idea and it's an instruction.
Yep.
Yeah.
And I've never been somebody who's been hierarchically driven or hierarchically motivated, but to see myself in that space and realise that I was in that space, that was an enormous learning space for me.
I think I share that with you. In the first 18 months and 2 years of becoming a CEO, one of the reflections I had was that this almost paranoia, everyone is listening to me. And on one part, it's like, everyone is listening to me. But another part is like, everyone is listening to me. I can't have a thought bubble or a brain fart without people expecting it to, was that serious? What do you want me to do with that? And I'm like, I don't want you to do anything with it. It's just everyone is listening to you. And it carries a responsibility that you don't really notice until you're carrying it.
And you fight that urge as well to have this fixed view of yourself as who you are and what you sound like and the kind of leader and the kind of person you will be. I've become really conscious as I've gone through my career that my voice changes. And, you know, I think about my voice as a teacher and the way that it evolved from somebody who was highly inexperienced to somebody, you know, who knew who he was as a teacher. And I've always argued when I've been working with teacher educators and teacher leaders that they need to work very hard at being the best version of themselves, not the second best version of somebody else. And I was very conscious last year as I was learning a community, I was learning a culture, I was learning a figurehead role, I was learning how people saw me in a different light, that my voice I was quite surprised by. And I was quite surprised by the way that I sounded and the way that I was positioned. And I have this belief that it will take a little bit of time as my experience grows and the things that I deal with on a day-to-day basis become more normalized and less exceptional, that I will find my voice. And my voice as a leader will sound really different in 18 months' time to what it did 18 months ago. So I felt an enormous pressure last year to have my leadership voice, and in a physical way and in a literal way when I'm working with a group of people or I'm at an event and those kinds of things, but then also in an implied or implicit way in terms of people hearing from me what good looks like. And then knowing that intuitively, I don't need to deliver on that, and I don't need to be that person in my first 12 months. That's going to come for me, and I've got to give myself some time.
Mm-hmm. It's also one of those things, the cognitive dissonance of suffering from imposter syndrome at the same time as having to have the answers, that pressure of, early on in this number one position of going, gosh, I'm new at this job, but nobody has any empathy for you being new at the job. You're supposed to be instantly good at it. But also that pressure to I've got to have the answers where as you settle in, you go, I don't have to have all the answers. I can find them along the way. What I have to do is create an authorizing environment for people to have answers themselves and have confidence to have answers and have confidence to be critical as well.
Yeah.
That's hard to do, isn't it?
Look, it is, and it's really easy in your first years in senior leadership to find fails. It's really easy to find examples of things that got part of the way there, but you didn't realise to that same degree that you really wanted to. It's much harder to find those wins.
Yeah.
And sometimes you need people around you to shine lights on those things for you and then to remind you of those things, particularly when you're in an environment that sets high standards and you want to set high standards for yourself. That can be, you can end up a little bit betwixt and between.
At the risk of, I don't usually do sporting analogies, but I'm going to do one now. But often you see examples of where elite footballers or elite cricketers are really great cricketers, so they make them captain. And suddenly they're terrible cricketers and terrible captains. And then they're relieved of the captaincy and their cricket returns really amazingly. Or they grow into being captains, but they're no longer really they're a good enough cricketer to hold their spot in the team, but they're great captains. But you never know until they're there and they see it. But there's this additional pressure, and in a visible role like yours and a visible role like professional athletes, where you don't really get respite from the world commenting and watching you. It's a particular role that you have compared to the founder of their own business or somebody working in corporate or that. It's more like an elite athlete who's now the captain of the team, isn't it? Where, you were really good at something else.
Yeah, it took me a while to be able to step back sometimes from the level of commentary and the level of opinion that people take on you, in a leadership role within a school community, about the impact and the efficacy of decisions that you make or strategy that you roll out. Because everybody does have an opinion because of their high emotional connection with the place. But for you then to be able to, I think in your own life, be able to pair, that technical expertise that you bring, and for me, it's it's within the teaching and learning frameworks of school life, and that's where I've grown up. And to be able to know that gives you the good foundation for good quality strategy and good quality decision making, and then for you to build also those community management skills on the sideline and bring those things together. It's never going to be a perfect union, and you're never going to work both ends of that spectrum perfectly at each time. But as long as you're cognizant of that, I think that's what's most important.
So Trent, I was just thinking we're kind of over an hour now, so I really would love to know what's next for you, for Scotch College. Do you have any programs that you'd like to talk about now that you're wanting to create, or something that is really going to maybe add a bit more of a positive change in the sector, in the education sector? Is there anything that you'd like to talk about?
I think there's lots of things in that space that's easy to be excited by. I'm really excited by what technology looks like for us in education, and how that will break some of the assumptions that we feel around the way that kids need to be educated, and also to how can we be far more impactful in school ways. Not how that we can use AI and how we can use technology to replace the work of a teacher in any sense, but how can we use it, I think, to highlight, to supercharge, the humanism that goes on in a school life. And so we are working really closely in that space at the minute and trying to push relatively fast in that space just to try and work out what's possible. And also too, I'm really conscious that we're in a fast-moving environment as well. And it is currently a space that's probably running a lot quicker than technology ran in the early 1990s, when we saw the internet become mainstream in education and in other areas of school life. I think there are increasing challenges for us in education. I just think in society in general, about what does workforce organisation and labour market and our interaction with labour markets look like. There are really significant pressure points for people who work in education. There are also pressures that society has now thrown on schools that we didn't have 30 years ago. There are things that we're asked to take responsibility for that used to be, the responsibilities of homes and churches and sporting clubs and community groups. But there's an expectation that schools now resolve those kinds of things.
Can you give some examples of what they are?
Character education. I reflect upon, the recent debates in this country over the past 5 or 6 years about consent education. So Chanel Contos shining a light on the role of consent and its interactions between boys and girls of teenage years, and the way that culture can create difficult circumstances and can place young women at a significant disadvantage, I think was the right conversation to have at that point in time. But that has become a school problem, and it's become a problem for schools to fix. And it's become something that communities are asking, how are we working with our children? And I don't think that's the wrong question to ask. But the other question to ask is, what's the role of the family unit? What's the role of parenting? What's the role of a highly connected family and child in building those character traits and setting those kinds of boundaries for kids? We often see it with behaviour management now, where schools will often be asked to assist in conflicts between children that don't originate within a school, that have got nothing to do with our school life, but are involved with two school-aged kids, but it very well might have happened on a holiday in a resort town, or they could have happened online on a Sunday night, in those kinds of ways, where we have accepted as schools that we can be a bit of a jack of all trades, and that we're prepared to take responsibility for growth and welfare and well-being in a range of different ways. And parents and families can now sometimes, push that back to us a little bit. So those kinds of pressures, have washed through education over the past 20 years and have changed the nature and the perception of the role of teachers. I think there's some really interesting work that we are currently doing about what does job design look like for teachers, and how can systems and structures support teachers to do what they do best.
Let's think about 16 to 18-year-old Trent. And
he had a really good mullet.
Yeah.
He had an amazing mullet before they were ironic.
Yeah. I had one of those back a very long time ago. What advice, if you were talking to 16 to 18-year-old Trent from where you are now, what would you say to him?
I'd say it's okay for things to be hard. 16 to 18-year-old Trent was able to coast quite nicely on the things that he could do well. And probably 21, 22-year-old Trent, when things got hard, probably hadn't had the learning and the training as a younger man, as a teenage man, to understand that the sun will come up tomorrow, and that there is actually a light at the end of the tunnel. It's not a train coming towards you. That'd be probably the first thing that I would say. And the second thing that I would probably say, that it's, it's going to be okay to be surprised by things. And that it's one thing to have hopes and dreams and aspirations and sort of see yourself on a path. But you're going to get your real joy, professionally and personally, by those things that surprise you along the way. And, your capacity to take those things with open arms are going to be really important for you.
Now, imagine you are 16 to 18-year-old Trent and you're talking to this old bloke who's the principal of a school. What advice would he give to you?
Oh, the 16-year. What
would 16-year-old Trent give to you now?
Yeah, he would probably ask me whether I'm angry enough, and he would probably ask me, whether I was as upset, or I should be. Why aren't I more upset about the things that he's upset about now as a 40, 50-year-old? I think you can intellectualize things that you feel passionate about after you live with them for a period of time. But as a young man, there's a visceral emotional experience that gets attached to those things, and that shows and that plays out in a range of different ways.
Yeah.
And I think that's probably an observation that they would make. I'm no less concerned about those things or no less angry about those things, but probably you express that in a very different way.
You regulate it better than back then. You're driving back to Scotch this afternoon and listening to the radio and a song comes on, and no matter what mood you're in, this song will make you smile. What is it?
Oh, that's a hard question.
It's always the hardest question.
Yeah. I always back myself as a trivia night as the song and artist guy.
Yeah.
I don't know. A roll down the windows kind of moment. Yeah, it would probably be, so a late 80s-y style Midnight Oil track. Maybe Hercules or maybe something from Diesel and Dust.
Yeah.
Something that drives hard. There was always a passion, no pun intended, about their work.
Yeah.
So all of that kind of stuff. I do love a cheesy 80s piece as well. I grew up during the new wave days.
Yeah.
So anything in that sort of space.
I'm fine. If you look on my playlist at the moment, it's all new wave stuff as well that perhaps when I was a young fella I wouldn't have admitted to, but now I really, really do enjoy. Trent, we've loved having you today. It's I hope for our listeners who the idea of this podcast is to talk to CEOs, talking to CEOs. You've brought a perspective today that's very different from the other CEs, but there are some things that are similar. The continuing to show up, the being rewarded for showing up and being the guy who always says yes and all of those sort of things are fairly similar themes. But I think today people would be surprised about the breadth of your role, the hours that your role and the visibility of your role takes. Thank you so much for giving us your time today. It's been really fantastic.
It's been great to chat. Thank you.